Well, welcome everybody to the first conference call of 2023. My name is Zach Smith. I'm the product and training specialist at Growers. I'm Canadian, live in Ontario, and I'll be your host for this call, host for most of the calls now. Tonight, we're going to be discussing some of Matt Gooding's research. Matt Gooding is a district manager for us in Ohio. He's also a research partner. And so he's been doing quite a bit of in-lab and in-field research. Tonight, we'll be discussing the pictures featured in the month of January in the 2023 Growers Calendar, which is of some lab work that Matt did last year during the winter that shows the effects of growers on root growth. And if he was able to find a way to do it that we could actually test the trace elements in growers and not just compare growers as a whole to, other fertilizers. So we'll be discussing those pictures tonight. There's a lot of information to go over. So I'm going to share my screen once we get started with the discussion, just to have the pictures up for anybody that is on a computer or a smartphone so you can see them. I also included them in the email that went out and in the text. So if you got those, hopefully you can get access to those pictures. It's a good visual aid, especially the one in the water culture. So with all that said, we'll have a time for questions throughout. I'll announce it when the time comes. You can unmute yourself, little microphone in the corner of your screen, or by dialing *6 if you're on a phone, a non-smartphone. Okay, let's get started. So Matt, I saw that you're on.
So welcome, you guys. Hey, Tiffin, Ohio is where I'm talking from those of you that are out there. Don't know where I'm located. I'm south of Lake Erie. Probably one of the most dreary days I think I've seen like ever in the last 2 or 3 years today. Really dark and dank and damp and rainy. We certainly need the rain here in the farm. Again, what I do is I'm second generation growers, farmer, so to speak. My dad started with the company back, was one of the first people to do different line plots. In fact, he did a lot of the line plots that are still documented that we would use to this day. So my life was always one of doing some sort of research stuff as a kid. You'd get off the school bus and have to, we had 700 acres back then, and, we had to do check plots before we could really get into doing something. And back then you had to run everything to the elevator and weigh everything with a truck and come back. We didn't have all this fancy stuff they have today. And so when I was a kid, I run a hydroponic greenhouse. I just had graduated. We borrowed money, first loan at Ag Credit. Dad backed me up, and I bought a 4,000 square foot greenhouse and raised lettuce and tomatoes and cucumbers in it. And I got my butt kicked in there initially, and kept on swimming. And even to this day, that whole experience has been incredibly valuable. One of the things that was done in that greenhouse is we made a commitment to use everything in there. We wanted to try to stay away from different chemical control and bug control. We wanted to see if we could keep everything ahead by virtue of plant health, and just stay ahead of the diseases and the bugs and stuff that would inhabit greenhouses, especially back then. I mean, this is the 80s. That's again, the technology of greenhouse development has certainly gone significantly up. And so we would mess with different fertilizers. We would use the traditional fertilizers that they would use to raise plants when we first started. Having used growers all my life, really never knew anything about dry fertilizers. We had seen how difficult it was to mix them. We would mix them up in a 300-gallon tank and circulate them under the lettuce and dump it out into a dump type hydroponic system to the tomatoes that was in the back. And there's always residues and filters plugging up from the fertilizers that would settle out, the dry fertilizers we try to mix up. And so we had switched it all over to growers. And once we understood water issues, to which, again, if you know us, we got a whole thing on water, and that's always evolving. And we're going to be educating our salesmen on water here in the probably next month again, kind of updating everybody on that. But we started using growers, and right away, the solubility issues have gone away, significantly cheaper. I mean, back then it was like $50 a week to run this thing off of dry fertilizer. That's in the 80s. It was crazy. And, we're using something as simple as, I think back then it was like $4 or $5 a week of growers. So that was a lot simpler in that respect. And there was some simple rules. We learned right away. I burnt the roots off of absolutely every plant that was in there because I would add the same amount of fertilizer to what is simply known as TDS, total dissolved solids. That is basically a measurement where you're running a tool, that a device, and they got more modern versions now than they did back then. Um, Basically, you're running electric current through the water. And just like how you measure electricity and resistance, same thing happens with this, in that you run this current through, and the more elements that's in the water, the higher the number that comes out. And that's known as total dissolved solids. It measures how much other stuff is suspended that you may or may not see in that water. And they have different scales of it. But it all really comes down to the same thing. It is measuring the elemental density of what you see or don't see in there. And so what I would do is you would add fertilizers to that and bring that TDS level up. Um, and that fertilizer adds to that TDS. Whenever you dissolve something in water, you're adding whatever that TDS of that water is, you're adding to it. And so I added growers at the same level because, young kid, made sense, right? Oh, no, 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 no. We just smoked every root off of those plants. And the reality of it is it ended up that I needed to use 10 times less TDS of growers over the other aspects because of growers availability. And so once I got past that learning curve, we would, things improved significantly and started to make a little money out of it along. Back then, Wilbur Franklin was the director of research of growers. He would be known as the disciple. I guess the best way to describe him is he was basically, I would say he's a disciple. If I was to describe him, he was a disciple of Doc Teagens, was around him in a lot of the research work, had the ability to interpret and describe and add on, having that direct contact with Doc Teagens. So although I was too young at the time to know Doc Teagens, I remember barely him. Wilbur Franklin was somebody who would become like my second dad. And so his goal in life was to educate me, and by challenging me in doing different things. And when I got this hydroponic greenhouse, he would bring down some book that Doc Teagens had, or some obscure something that Doc Teagens had done at a research station, in Delaware, back in the late 40s, early 50s. And we would talk about how maybe we could use this in this greenhouse to learn something. And he always loved doing that because he knew that, I'd read something and he was going to get a phone call, and he would. And we would hash this out, an 18, 19-year-old, and that's what we did. But one day he brought down some growers. He had fished some growers out during the production process. The trace elements, are put in at a specific time. They're proprietary and in specific amounts. And he had brought down some growers that did not have any trace elements in it. So it was just NPK. It was 10-20-10 NPK, period. And I had the lettuce greenhouse up and running. I wasn't adding any other fertilizers other than just growers and the water I had. I did have some natural magnesium and calcium in the well water I was using. It was difficult, but doable. I didn't have to add very much growers to it, and it all was working. Although now I would say it was marginal compared to what I know now. Then I could have probably improved it significantly, but it was working. And he goes, hey, when you dump this next tank, instead of using growers as growers is, which again, we don't list the trace elements because it's proprietary, but they're there. He goes, put that in and let's see what happens. So I think I had like I want to say I think I had 25 to 3,000 head of lettuce at different ages, and it all looked in good stead. And so when I cleaned out the tank, which you would do about once a week, and fresh water, fresh fertilizer, and start over, uh, put this non-trace element growers in. And I'm gonna tell you guys, you want to talk about the facial a splat. I mean, 24 hours later, there wasn't any age that was in that greenhouse that looked worth a snot. It yellowed. It was yellowing really quickly, and you got about you got about 1 day to figure that out and correct it, or because of the short lifespan of lettuce being basically, in that time it was an 8-week crop, you know, once it makes its decision, it doesn't recover well. I mean, it isn't like a tomato that you can burn the roots off and you recover and you can still get something productive out of it. Um, and so uh, it didn't take me very long till we immediately switched that around and put the regular growers back in, and it recovered, but not as it was tough. It was a tough recovery, and I now understand why that was. But the reality of it is not having the trace elements in caused all these issues. Clearly, one of the things that you notice is in the younger lettuce that was starting out, that was everything was done in a gutter type system. Think of eave trough trays that was put in that, and they were like 12 feet long, and there were like 14, 15 plants in each one, and you'd have water run under them, and the roots would grow in that tray, and it was covered. The roots were covered with another piece of plastic, and the lettuce would be on top, and the roots would be underneath, sitting in the water that's running under them. Um, in the younger ones, that was just basically a piece of plywood covered in plastic that you run a thin film of water over. And you would start the plugs, as they were called, basically in a cotton material, and the roots would go down and touch the water it's flowing past. And those roots looked, they grew quite rapidly usually there. But boy, during that 24, 36 hours that we used Grow Without Trace elements, the subdivisions of them were horrendous. In other words, they went more stringy, and I remember that. And so, and so it goes, Wilbur would laugh and goes, well, he goes, yeah, and of course, back then you didn't have the digital cameras or anything to really document stuff. And you know, we were farming 700 acres. I think I was working a part-time job taking care of a YMCA pool in town of 20,000 people, and doing this greenhouse, and chasing what would be my future wife. I'm not going to do this very well, and I didn't document it. So here we are 40 years later, doing this research stuff, and the trace element question still would come up, and my customers and a lot of the salesmen's customers, you claim there's trace elements in it, but how do we know that? And what are they? And what amounts? And like it always amused me, like, okay, so some of these other companies, competitors, well, you don't even list your trace elements, you don't even know what you got in there, and this, that, and the other thing. That's like, well, I really doubt if you know what you got in there either. um, so like, you're the person to judge. And so I wanted to develop a simple way to be able to show everyone that these things exist and they are incredibly important. um, Doc Tegens was able to come up with the trace element mixture that was um, unique in that, in the world of trace elements, and we all know about the periodic chart, I can't say that word very well, of chart of elements, where they assign a molecular weight to them. All these different elements have a different molecular weight. I always like to liken it to the simple statement that what weighs more, a ton of feathers or a ton of lead? And immediately all our minds will go to the lead until we realize exactly what the question was. Which weighs more, a ton? They both are a ton, they're equal. But we all know they take up a lot more space to take up the feathers versus the lead. Well, in the world of elements, that's kind of the way it is. Like, a copper, manganese, the different things that are added as trace elements to growers all weigh different amounts. And to get them to suspend and hang out together, in a solution that really doesn't fall out of solution is usually not done. That's one of the so unique aspects of growers. Um, and the qualities and properties that come from that are just immense. I mean, we could talk hours on that in different subject matters. But the reality of it is the stock had probably messed around with different trace element mixtures and probably fell flat on his face growing different stuff. Because if you look at some of his more obscure um, data and research stuff that he did, and he had black and white pictures of stuff and everything. I mean, this guy used to raise perfect tomatoes in pH 9 soil. Okay, and that's not even considered possible. So he had this knowledge that was, for his time, and even today, his observatic knowledge had to be off the charts to be able to do this. So you got all these different molecular weights, and you're bonding it basically to a very clean source of phosphate, so everything stays suspended, so it's all available at the same time. And so I wanted to develop this so it showed it. And so, I had asked Rick, the president and owner of Growers, that I would like to, I think I got an idea on how to easily show this. So it's just visual. So there's just really no question. I had no doubt that if I could have him make up, or if he would make up a batch of growers without trace elements, I had no doubt what the result would be because I had experienced it that 40 years before. And now I had the different equipment, different little simple ways and different protocols and enough knowledge to be able to do it. Well, Rick, I mean, it was in no time he told me, hey, I got some. So I was really excited. So I put this whole thing together, and you see it on the calendar, you see it in the pictures. I don't know if Zach's functional. I'm not really watching the screen right now, that whether he's putting that up or it's on your phone, or you may have seen it in I think it's in the latest newsletter too. It's been around for not quite a year now. I was shocked at the results. I mean, they were quite profound, more so than what I thought. Um, the and I wanted to compare it to everybody, these 918-9s out here. Some of them have trace elements, some of them don't. Most of the time, if they have trace elements, they 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 can't hang on. Their phosphate is too poor of grade, and the process of how it's made, the trace elements don't bond to the phosphate, so they'll separate out when it's cold, or even like in something like an experiment like this, you will get where trace elements will end up at the bottom. So the 918-9 I had was a 918-9 that in doing a lot of other experiments and drying and doing physical properties of fertilizers where I dry them and freeze them and stuff, I picked a 918-9 of the stuff that, well, a lot of the salesmen had given me out here and what I could find. And I picked the one that had properties and that was closest to growers, um, with no trace, and I wanted to see, I figured I needed to use that because if I would have used one with trace elements in a stagnant water system like this, you would have found that a lot of there'd be residue at the bottom of the 918-9. If you're looking at a picture, for those who don't have a picture, I basically got 4 vials filled with, I use reverse osmosis water, so there's no TDS in it. So this is just, there's very little TDS in it. There's like 5 parts, which is nothing. Okay. So I use that water, and then I basically use dilutions of 500 to 1. That was learned to be the most fair dilution for nearly any type of liquid fertilizer in this environment. It was the most fair to do. Because none of, at that ratio, the TDS isn't raised up high enough where you get root burn very easily. So that's, for instance, if I did all of them at 100 to 1, probably the worst picture would have been the growers because of its availability. It's just it's so off the charts. So, um, so as you can see, there's basically four of these vials, and one of them's a 918-9. One of them says NT-GMS, that's no trace elements. Then I just use plain RO water, so you can see how that worked. And then was the regular growers as it is sold today. The vials were the corn seedlings. We raise open pollinated corn here for the animal part of our operation. So I chose to use open pollinated corn so that way the seeds I can take from one cob. And then what I do with them is I sprout them in water. I'm continually improving how to do that. Um, but basically, I use think of it as a thick paper, and I sprout them on that, and then I pick out equal sprouts of length and vigor and place them in these vials so they're from the same genetic cob. So in other words, I'm not like the, if you just use a handful of corn and you can have, it can be from different plants, but this is all from the same plants, from the same cob, which takes away some of the genetic differences right away there that, that you would have differences. Um, I grew them under somewhat now. I have a better lighting system, but the color of the corn you can't really pay attention to because part of it is when I took the pictures under that particular glow light, because of digital technology, you don't always get good reflective pictures. In fact, if you look at some of the other ones that I did in sand, you'll see that the color's better, and that's because they were removed out from under that light. And so that's part of the issue. You have to kind of ignore that part of it, at least with the hydroponic ones. And so you can see the results. I mean, the amount of vigor of trace elements, the vigor and weight of the top parts of the plant when they were dried and weighed were all higher significantly. You can see the 918-9s, you can see to what level that they grew versus the growers' no trace elements. A lot of that could say that there was some similarity. I think if I remember right, the growers without trace elements, the weight of the roots in the plant top was higher in the different experiments I did right along in nearly every one I did like that. It's interesting where there's just 5 TDS water. That's just basically, that would be almost equal to rainwater. I mean, you can see how little of something makes such a big difference, just huge. And so we said, okay, so that's kind of neat. Let's grow some in sand, because the reality of it is sand does have, even though it's not organically, there's not a lot of biology in it, if any. And I was using, basically I went to Lowe's and bought play sand. And so basically they wash that stuff out and they sterilize it or whatever they do. And so, but it has some calcium, magnesium, and other elements that would contribute to a plant's growth. And so we have another picture in the calendar. I don't know if you have that, Zach, or not. I don't, but that would have been grown in sand. And again, with the same dilutions, think of me using the same water for these that was in the hydroponics, basically 500 to 1. Think of me just pouring them off into the sand ones. So everything, again, is keeping stuff uniform and the same. And Zach, that's coming out real small for you. There you go. Thank you. And again, for those of you not or cannot see, we did again 918-9 growers with no trace, 5 TDS RO water and growers. Again, same thing, basically same thing. Everything's the same. We watered them just once with that solution, just basically flooded everything and let them grow till they almost started to wilt. And then we yanked everything out and we allowed them to dry out. And we would weigh the tops and the root systems. And while it was interesting to note that the sand, especially in the RO water, improved the roots significantly. It was amazing. That was kind of really interesting. There's really no NPK value in sand, but there is better oxygenation and transfer of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis through that sand than would be hydroponic, especially stagnant hydroponic. And so consequently, the RO water one improves significantly in root structure and everything. And the difference between the GMS and no trace and with the traces in at first blush appears to be virtually the same. When it came down to the structural weight of it, that trace elements added a lot of weight again. being in that environment where there was better respiration in the soil, isn't drowned respiration. Um, and the 918-9 was just a utter disaster. I still can't. I still look at that and I go, what in the world is that all about? And Zach Smith in his analysis, if you read the newsletter and growers this month, he did a really good job of pointing out that basically is yeah, a lot of these fertilizer companies don't go through the rigorous tests that growers does to try to, when you're getting all these raw materials in, and to keep a quality control of a product, the more products you're messing with, the harder it is to do quality control. um, you know, growers has enough of a harder time finding pure enough ingredients on the market, that they're not lying, that they're not slipping something in. It's a hard thing. Um, by default, the way growers is made, if we got something that was, if somebody tried to slip in something where they cheated on us and had some sort of other toxin, especially in heavy metal trace elements, growers isn't going to go together nor work. The guy mixing it up will go, wow, what color is that? What residue is that? That doesn't necessarily happen in a lot of other fertilizers and how they're made under the cold process. And so, that's why growers, when you run it through something like our CNA, the availability index, we're always higher. And so that's what all of a sudden takes that whatever cost of growers is per gallon versus others, it takes that away really, really quickly. Because when you figure those trace elements and you can see what they do, and then when you see the purity of something, the availability goes up. And so that's one of the things that this shows also that is a really big deal. So, hey, you know what? We're on to some other stuff that's right now. I got some stuff in the lab, and I just was smiling today. I'm going, oh boy, if it keeps going this way, we're going to have another bunch of stuff to talk about here. And um, we're doing kind of some, how do I say, the next generation of this, so to speak, I guess is the best way. Again, very positive to date. We'll see, because I've done some different lighting to get see, grow lights in corn is a tough thing. You got to have the right type of light and everything, which is a whole nother thing that we're going to be discussing with the sales force here when we start doing our winter just discussions that we do. Because this whole light thing is going to be a real big deal, and with what's happening to our weather and stuff, we have to understand when we get in these dull, cloudy days, or you get some of these other dust issues and moisture issues in the air, what it's really meaning to plants. We're going to be able to kind of give people insights on that, and that's coming out here too shortly. Okay, I'll come up for air. That was a 25-minute run on that. And Zach, you take over, and whether somebody wants to ask questions on that or whatever you wanted to do, I'm done.
Okay, sorry, I realized I was muted. I'm gonna search out a couple of other things to put up on the screen that I want to talk about with regarding these experiments. So we can take questions in the meantime while I get that ready. So if you don't have a question, just unmute yourself and ask away.
So anybody got any questions in this? I mean, let's face it, you know, you have to understand trace elements work synergetically. I've always told my customers, and I learned it the hard way in the hydroponic world. You'll hear and you'll read, you guys, stuff in the farm papers, and this trace element's the best thing ever. You need to add zinc, and they'll put out data and they'll have stuff on there. And the problem is not all zincs are alike. Zinc is one of the most contaminated elements out there. And a lot of times the person or company, and maybe they're not necessarily bad, but unless they're really vigilant, they have no idea that the zinc a lot of times brings cadmium with it, and you're not going to get the benefits of zinc. You're going to have to add a lot more, and you're actually creating a toxin. That was such a big thing up in New York. I remember talking to University of Cornell University trace element expert one time. We were talking about it, and he said how overused single source trace elements are. And he was saying some soils up in New York in the vegetable area had put on too much copper. They were actually adding copper while also using copper-based fungicides. And you know what? You get too much one-dimensionalism of something, it doesn't work. Yet when you do something synergetically together, these trace elements, the arrangement of these to not only stay in solution, um, but also work together, it doesn't take but very little, incredible little amounts. Um, there's some data that I just don't release between the no trace and growers. I just don't want to talk about it, but I will tell you how little it is, but how incredibly important that balance of it needs to be. So, any questions out there? I don't know if Zach has got what he wanted up there, but
Yeah.
It's just
Can I ask?
Go ahead.
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question about how does the presence of microorganisms in hydroponics affect the availability and mobility of the trace elements?
I have a customer that runs a fish pond. I call it a fish ponding operation. He doesn't like that, but the basic aspect of it is there's he grows like several. Oh, what are they? Let me think about that. I think they were like 800-gallon tanks. Boy, Andrew, if you're listening, you're gonna butt in and tell me otherwise. But there's 7 or 8 of them, and they have fish in them, and then that water cycles through and under lettuce, and that basically circulates back through the fish again. And the trick on that thing is there has to be biology hydroponically in that for that whole thing to work. And one of the hardest things about those operations is getting them started, because when the fish poops, it's their manure is very caustic ammonia, and they need to convert it into nitrate. And so when the water that runs through those fish runs into this tank that is got like a wadded up, you've seen along the road that people have trampolines in their backyard, and they have like these fences around them, or like a netting around them, so the kid doesn't fall off and splat in the ground. It's netting like that, and they wad that up and they throw it in a tank, and the water from the fish goes in there, and the bacteria start growing on that, and they convert the ammonia into a nitrate, so that when it goes out, it's pre ready to go for the lettuce. Okay. And so what happens is this all matures on the bottom of the float tanks that the lettuce floats on these foam boards. The lettuce roots go down in these tanks, and on the bottom of those tanks there gets to be biology like you wouldn't believe. I mean, you're talking off the charts, thick material, looks like junk. It just teems with bacteria. And so that biology, in essence, balances and keeps that thing near bulletproof in terms of nutrition. It never really changes. And so there's no fertilizers or anything added to it. In fact, growers is used in that only as a foliage feeding operation. I think he uses 3 ounces per week of growers to foliage feed across 2,500 head a week is what he harvests. This thing is huge. This greenhouse is huge, but he uses that to help build weight to the lettuce, because if he doesn't have enough lettuce for the market. So all it takes is 3 ounces. And so much of it is because its biology is interacting and working with that in through that hydroponic type setup. I think to further answer your question a little bit, he has another section in there that is just utterly fascinating. He has and I want to say it's somewhere north of 100-gallon tank. And I think he throws a half a pint of growers in that, and it circulates through microgreens. It's a small area in the greenhouse, and it makes him a fortune, because these chefs like all these little fancy microgreens of different stuff, little kale and little versions of different things that it's like, okay. And he gets a high dollar for it. but he circulates that under them, and everything does fine. But what's fascinating is he uses reverse osmosis water with this growers in it, and it all works fine. But if he changes that water out, cleans that tank out, puts fresh RO water in, puts that little bit of growers in, hardly anything, when he first starts to circulate that, it'll burn every root of every variety in there immediately, until he gets just the smallest amount of biology going in there. And as soon as he does that, that RO water being that pure and that growers being that available, is instantly, I want to say, tamed, so to speak. And so then none of that happens. And so he doesn't clean the tank out anymore. He can just tell when the plants run down a little bit and they don't have quite the color. He adds a little bit more growers, and that way the biology is already there. Again, it basically comes from the tank, or in along the lines and everything. That biology all works synergetically with growers, and it's perfect. It's one of the simplest recirculating systems in existence. In other words, there's no fancy acid adders. There's no injectors where they have to control pH and their computer monitors. That's all he does. And his friends and his people he knows within the hydroponic world, and they're just amazed that he can do this with absolutely nothing. So yes, it has a big role, in this. In these particular experiments, though, there's virtually no biology at all in them, in that water. Now in the sand, there would have been eventually, just from the air and everything, you're going to slowly get that. That's what we're starting to see now that we have this biometer you hear us talking about. We've came up with another way. I'm working with the biometer people. This device basically can measure biology in real time, which is spectacular. So we've got experiments going on right now, and they're already, well, so much of the time, what I think is going to happen and what ends up happening and the direction I go is always different. Well, we've done a U-turn already because it's pretty cool stuff. And so that'll be getting released here, some of the preliminary stuff to share with everyone as time goes on. So yes, to answer your question, it's a big deal. And so those are the best examples I could give. Okay, does that answer your question?
I'd like to add a little bit there, just on principle, that the most biologically active part of the soil is in the rhizosphere around plant roots. Now, in the soil, there's obviously an established home where, like, you have a source essentially for microbes. If you were to introduce a new, if you had a sterile plug from your house or something, you introduce it into the soil, it would absorb microbes from around it, from that soil, that would eventually colonize it. In a water setting, it's different than the soil, but you still have that rhizosphere, and it's actually even more pronounced, I would say, as the most beneficial zone for the microbes to live in. So as long as you had a source of microbes in your hydroponic operation, which, I mean, they're everywhere, so I think there's always a source, eventually they're going to colonize that root zone. And the denser the roots, the more there is to colonize, because it's a matter of surface area. So I hope that sheds a little bit of extra light on that, just on not so much an example, but an explanation based on principle.
Yes,
yeah,
thank
very
you.
good, Zach. Yeah, that was very good. Very good.
Yeah,
Any
you're
other
welcome.
questions?
Yeah, Matt, I'd like to make a comment.
Mhm.
The comment is on the trace elements or micronutrients and what Matt's demonstrated, and his emphasis on the small amount of the trace elements that are in there, and everybody's fascination with volume of nutrients. The conclusion that we see in the industry is that the volume of the trace elements is very small. And the problem with that is distribution. If you've only putting in, 12 ounces per acre of zinc, are you going to cover the whole acre with that 12 ounces? And see, this is where the hot mix methodology has to come in, because like Matt says, you've got to lock that micronutrient to that phosphorus and distribute it, but it can't separate. This week, when we were in Missouri over by Kansas City, we were talking to some farmers that showed us the fertilizer that they were working with, which was a 3-18-18, 9-18-9, 7-21-7, you name it. But they were given the trace elements in a brown bag, throw it in there, agitate, and you're ready to go. Well, they didn't use the whole amount of the fertilizer with the suspended micronutrients. And so they pumped that back into a cage tank. And it was sitting there in the shop where we were doing the meeting, and you could see the stratification in there. And they said it just settled to the bottom for them. And it settled bad enough they couldn't suck it out of there because everything was laying on the bottom. And see, this is a problem with this addition of these zinc in the 1034O or zinc in the 28%. If you're not hot mixing and get that thermal agitation, segregation is going to be a problem. And see, when you're working with very small amounts to make them work correctly, that's got to be distributed in that solution all the time. And see, for us being registered as a feed supplement, it's even more critical, because you can't overload one animal and have absolutely nothing in another animal. And see, again, that's a cost factor for us as a company. So this idea that you're just going to suspend that stuff and keep the agitation going, those guys said, it just didn't work. And of course, they got money back on it. And the guy said, I just didn't get the right volumes in there. That's all a coverage, in my opinion. The fact that it wasn't hot mixed or getting the thermal agitation. When you start talking micronutrients, distribution is going to be a serious problem. And I think Matt's experiment pretty well showed how critical they are to that root growth. And see, in the program, we're trying to build a porous soil with calcium, and we want those roots going everywhere. And see, the trace elements help that immensely. So that's something that I think everybody has to consider, is the methodology that these micronutrients are put into the fertility product. That's it, Zach.
Thanks, Jim. I wanted to bring this picture back up to kind of drive home your point. You guys I know Matt covered this, but take a look at how much of a difference there is between, oh, come on. There we go. Between the regular GMS and the GMS with no trace elements. These are both hot mix products. They're both using the same clean ingredients. The only difference is a lack of trace elements in the one on the left, the second one from the left. So you can see there, it's, first of all, I mean, this is obvious proof that the trace elements are there, that there is a difference between those two. But also the effect that it's having and how much more pronounced that effect is over the same product without those trace elements. So like this picture, this is the picture that's worth 1,000 words, and those are Matt's words. So take a good look at it. I hope you guys all have this picture, because I think it's quite powerful. Because there's no other explanation here. So anyway, that's all. I just wanted to bring their attention back to that. Are there any other questions?
Hey, Zach, I'd like to comment again if I can.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
This is all current events. The WASAID report came out today, gentlemen, and I think the Growers Network, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, that's just the interaction between customers in the 30 states that we work in. The customers have been telling us that there is an issue with the amount of corn out there. the advisors throughout the industry have been bad mouthing corn for quite a while now, as they took the price down. We got a nice bump in the fall, and then they started dragging it down, bounced back a little bit during harvest or later harvest, and they just been trying to wedge away on it, hammer away on it. Well, when the WASDE report came out today, they cut 500,000 acres out of the production. And see, right away, everybody says, well, how can that possibly be? Well, it's very simple. Our people in the Dakotas and Minnesota have been telling us that there was an awful lot of corn being chopped up there because the drought was killing them. And guys needed feed for livestock. And see, as soon as you chop that corn stalk, they consider that a non-productive corn stalk. The government does. And that's where that 500,000 acres went, was in the silage production. So with that, the yield did go up a little bit because you got rid of the poorer acres. And so that'll drag the yield up. But that increase in yield with the 500,000 acres whittled out of there took the total amount of production down pretty significantly. And it put 15 cents. It was 20 cents on corn a lot today. And then again, they did a little of that with soybeans, but our network has been telling us that. And see, guys are saying, all the so-called expert advisors were saying the opposite. And so again, I think it's a very good demonstration of interaction with producers themselves rather than the people that are just talking about it. And so again, what's that going to do for fertilizer prices? The literature over the Christmas holidays basically said these fertilizer, Nutrien, Mosaic, they've made so much money at this point that they've met all their shareholder goals. And so they're basically going to shut down production. And why should they produce at a lower price? And see, this is going to be a problem, guys, as far as availability is concerned. We're getting feedbacks on that guys are finding certain products harder to get. And I know guys have been dragging their feet. They don't like prices. I agree. I don't like it either. But as we get closer to spring, guys have got to start getting this figured out, because the availability could be a problem. If these big companies don't do any more mining, the availability is just not going to be there. And again, the ag weather guys are saying, we've had this real mild weather, so that should not natural gas back. That should bring anhydrous down. They're saying by the end of next week, we're going to be back into a little bit colder pattern that they say will last into March. So again, that's going to take away that opportunity for natural gas to get very cheap. So again, I think you need to look this over. Again, I'm not saying we're trying to scare anybody into purchasing, but you've got to make a decision what you're going to deal with this year. One other thing I would like to comment on over the holidays, Ken Ferry and Missy Bauer put out a big article in Farm Journal about this fertilizer relay that they're talking about. And again, this is something that Matt's got his hands full, but this is where we've kind of driven him into this idea of so much material in the furrow and then so much material at another position, 2x2 or next to the row, covered a little bit. We're going to try to search that out. And if you look at the pictures that Ferry and Bauer put out, they're very similar to the ones that we had in the solution a couple of years ago, trying to get that fertilizer area so that once the seed germs, that root is growing in that fertility all the time. And their articles are stating point blank, you want to do that to keep that plant as aggressive as possible to knee high to waist high. And again, some of the literature I write, a run hog is a run hog. And they're agreeing with that, saying that you want that plant to be as aggressive as possible in that early growth stage. And then the other thing that they're advocating too, and And Ferry has been talking about this, that you bulk spread that phosphorus, man. That root seeking that out is very, very inefficient. And we know that's true because of Lake Erie, you know, the Chesapeake Bay, Gulf of Mexico. There's stuff getting away from agriculture. And see, they're trying to promote a methodology to concentrate this stuff as close to the plant as possible. And see, this is Matt's experiment there pretty well demonstrates what we can do, you know, for the producer. And so again, the CNA kind of shows that our availability is high enough that the price is not inhibitory. It actually is very, very competitive. So again, the science is there. The industry is moving in our direction, that we're not moving in their direction. You know, Vic Artesian's got this going in 55 with a couple partners, and it's becoming a very big issue right now. Environmentally, the government has tried to get farmers to look at this seriously, and they're going to continue to do that. I think crop insurance is going to be tied to, you know, how you're fertilizing eventually. But they like this high price, guys. This is a way to get guys to cut back, to try to get the environmental results that they're looking for. So I think this trace element thing and the dramatic effect that it has on this root growth, that pretty well demonstrates what we're talking about. If you're going to whittle back on nitrogen, that root zone on the right there is going to have a lot more possibilities of picking up in than the other areas. That's what I got, Zachy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. We're about at the end, so if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll wrap the call up. Thanks everybody for listening in. Our next call will be on February 9th at 9 p.m. Eastern time again. And we hope to see, I guess, all of you then. Thanks for listening in.